This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. Part 1. The invitation never came. That was the first sign something was wrong. Although in my family, silence had always been a kind of language. Weeks before Thanksgiving, my phone buzzed constantly with group messages from cousins sharing travel plans, aunts discussing desserts, and my mother reminding everyone to arrive early this year because my brother's engagement would be celebrated at the same dinner. Photos of decorations, hints about a surprise announcement, excited emojis from relatives who rarely spoke to me otherwise. The whole family seemed to orbit around an event that I somehow existed outside of. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. Families forget things, emails get lost, text threads splinter into smaller ones. But as the days passed, the realization began to sink in like cold rain through a thin coat. No message ever reached me. No call from my parents, no casual mention from my brother, and yet I knew the party was happening. My cousin Daniel accidentally confirmed it when he sent me a screenshot meant for someone else. A seating chart, a carefully arranged list of names placed around a long dining table, my parents at the head, my brother and his fiancée beside them, aunts, uncles, cousins, even distant relatives who usually only showed up at weddings and funerals. My name wasn't there. For a long moment, I simply stared at the screen. It shouldn't have surprised me. Exclusion had always been my unofficial role in the family. My brother Ethan was the golden one. Perfect grades, law school, engagement to a woman whose parents owned half the medical offices in our county. The kind of life our parents proudly described at church gatherings. And me. I had been the strange one who moved to the city with no clear plan, chasing business ideas that sounded ridiculous at Thanksgiving tables. Startups, venture capital, early investments. Words that made my uncles laugh and my mother sigh like I had announced I wanted to become a street magician. They never understood what I did. More accurately, they never tried. Years ago, during another Thanksgiving, my father had leaned back in his chair and asked me how my little internet gamble was going. My brother chuckled. My aunt joked that maybe one day I'd get a real job like Ethan. The table had erupted in polite laughter while I quietly finished my drink. That night was the last time I tried explaining anything. So when I realized I wasn't invited to the engagement celebration, part of me simply nodded. Of course. Why include the family disappointment in the most important dinner of the year? Still, something about it lingered, because while they were planning their celebration, something else was happening behind the scenes. Something none of them knew about. Something that had been building quietly for months, like a storm gathering strength far out at sea. The funny thing about being underestimated is that people stop watching what you do, and my family had stopped watching me a very long time ago. What they didn't know was that by the time Thanksgiving arrived, I would be sitting at a very different table, a much larger one. And when the truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't just ruin their dinner. It would change the entire future of our family. Part 2. 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, I bought a ticket home. Not because I was invited, because curiosity can be stronger than pride. The plane ride from San Francisco to Chicago was the same one I had taken dozens of times over the years. Yet this time it felt strangely different. For the first time, I wasn't returning as the family experiment. I wasn't the younger brother who tried strange tech projects while everyone else pursued respectable careers. I was returning with information none of them had, the kind of information that quietly changes power. Outside the airplane window, the clouds stretched endlessly across the horizon, and for a moment I found myself thinking about the last Thanksgiving I attended in person, 5 years earlier. That dinner had been the unofficial breaking point between me and my family. It started harmlessly enough. My mother had asked about my work, the way she always did, that with polite curiosity that never lasted long enough to hear the full answer. I told her about a startup I had invested in, something related to logistics software for small retailers. I tried explaining how supply chain data could reshape distribution networks. Halfway through my explanation, my uncle interrupted with a chuckle. He asked if that meant I was still gambling on computer ideas. My brother laughed. Not cruelly. Ethan rarely needed to be cruel. His confidence did the job effortlessly. He leaned back in his chair and said something about how it must be nice having a career where failure didn't matter because it wasn't real money. The table laughed again. That moment stuck with me longer than it should have. Not because of the joke itself, but because everyone assumed it was harmless. To them, my work wasn't something serious enough to defend. Even my parents didn't disagree. My father simply shook his head and said that eventually I'd settle down and find something stable, something respectable. That was the year I stopped coming home. For a while, the distance worked both ways. My family stopped asking about me beyond occasional holiday messages. I stopped explaining anything about my life. It was easier that way. Meanwhile, things changed, quietly at first. The startup my uncle mocked eventually grew into a company worth hundreds of millions. My early investment multiplied many times over. Then came another deal, then another. I learned quickly which founders to trust and which industries were about to explode. 5 years later, the career they once called a gamble had built something substantial. Not flashy, not public, but powerful. And somewhere along that journey, a strange piece of information crossed my desk during a routine investment briefing. A mid-sized regional manufacturing company had started struggling financially after several bad expansion decisions. The board was looking for new capital to stabilize operations before things got worse. Normally, I would have passed on a company like that, except for one detail. The company name, Harper Industrial Solutions. My family's business, the company my father built over 30 years. The company Ethan was supposed to inherit one day. The same company that had never taken my career seriously. I remember sitting in my office late that night, reading the financial reports twice just to make sure I understood them correctly. Revenue declining, debt increasing, operational inefficiencies piling up. It was a fragile situation. The board had quietly begun searching for outside investors, and no one in my family knew. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the skyline beyond the office windows, feeling something strange settle into place. Not revenge. Not exactly. More like an opportunity that arrived at the most unexpected time. Which is why, 3 weeks later, I was sitting on that plane heading home for Thanksgiving, still technically uninvited. But this time, the circumstances were very different, because while my family was preparing to celebrate my brother's engagement, they had no idea their company was about to gain a new lead investor. And they definitely didn't know who that investor was. Part 3. By the time the plane landed, the sky above Chicago had already turned the dull gray color that always arrives just before winter takes control of the Midwest. Cold wind cut across the parking lot outside the airport as I walked toward the rental car station, hands buried in my coat pockets. The city felt smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I had simply grown used to places where nobody knew my history. Home had a way of reminding you who people believed you were. The drive toward the suburbs took nearly an hour, long enough for memories to surface whether I wanted them to or not. Familiar highways, exit signs I had passed 1,000 times growing up, restaurants where my family celebrated birthdays when life was simpler. Back then, Harper Industrial Solutions was the pride of our household. My father built it from almost nothing, a small warehouse operation that supplied metal components to regional construction companies. Over the years, it expanded into a mid-sized manufacturing business with several hundred employees and contracts across multiple states. To my parents, it was more than a company. It was proof that hard work created stability. My brother Ethan grew up inside that story. Every summer during high school, he worked at the company warehouse. Every college break, he sat in meetings with my father. Everyone in the family knew how the future would unfold. Ethan would eventually take over. It was practically a family tradition before it even happened. I took a different path. While Ethan memorized supply chains and production schedules, I spent my college years obsessed with technology startups. I followed market trends, studied venture deals, and talked about ideas that sounded ridiculous to people who built their lives around physical businesses. My father used to listen patiently at first. Then came the concerned looks, then the quiet disappointment. By the time I moved to San Francisco, the distance between us had already formed. And now, years later, that distance had returned me here under circumstances none of them expected. The rental car pulled into a small parking lot across the street from a brick office building I knew very well. Harper Industrial Solutions headquarters. I sat in the car for a moment before stepping out. The building looked exactly the same as it always had. Modest. Practical. The kind of place built by someone who cared more about efficiency than appearances. Inside, the lights were still on. Several members of the board were waiting for me upstairs. They were expecting the representative of an investment group based in San Francisco, a group that had been quietly negotiating with them for weeks to secure a major ownership stake in the company. Technically, that description wasn't wrong. The investment group did exist, but the lead investor behind it remained anonymous, at least for now. I walked into the building and nodded politely to the receptionist, who didn't recognize me after all these years. That small detail made the situation feel even stranger. I'd grown up inside this company, yet now I entered it as an outsider, or something more complicated. The boardroom door opened as I approached. Inside sat 6 people around a polished table, senior managers, 2 outside board members, and 1 financial advisor who had been coordinating the negotiations. My father wasn't there, neither was Ethan. They believed these meetings were still preliminary. One of the board members stood up and extended his hand. He greeted me with the polite enthusiasm reserved for investors who might save a company from serious trouble. None of them seemed to notice the strange irony of the moment. Because while they were welcoming me as the potential financial lifeline for Harper Industrial Solutions, they had absolutely no idea whose son was standing in front of them. And tomorrow night, while my family gathered for Thanksgiving dinner without inviting me, everything would begin to unfold. Part 4. The boardroom smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. The same combination I remembered from childhood visits when my father used to bring Ethan and me to the office on quiet Saturday mornings. Back then, the room had felt enormous. Now it felt smaller, more tense. 6 people sat around the table reviewing financial documents when I entered. Laptops open, spreadsheets glowing on screens. The quiet anxiety of a company trying to stay ahead of a growing problem. They looked up as I stepped inside. The financial advisor, a man named Charles Denton, was the first to stand. I had spoken with him several times through video calls during the past month, though always under the carefully structured identity of a representative from our investment firm. Today was the first time we met in person. He shook my hand with the confident politeness of someone trying to keep a complicated deal moving forward. He introduced me to the others around the table, 2 senior board members who had joined the company years after my father founded it, the chief operations officer, a legal consultant, and 1 quiet woman who oversaw the company's financial restructuring efforts. Every introduction carried the same subtle expectation. They were looking at me as a possible solution, someone who might stabilize a company that had begun to wobble after several aggressive expansions went wrong. I took my seat at the table. The meeting began almost immediately. Charts appeared on the large screen at the end of the room. Revenue trends, operational expenses, debt schedules stretching across the next 5 years. The numbers painted a picture that was far less stable than the confident image my father often presented at family dinners. Harper Industrial Solutions wasn't collapsing. but it was standing on uncertain ground. One of the board members explained how a series of equipment upgrades and facility expansions had drained more capital than expected. Then a few contracts were lost during a rough market cycle. Suddenly, the margins tightened. Then came the debt. The company needed a significant cash injection to stabilize operations and restructure several loans before lenders began asking difficult questions. That was where our investment group entered the picture. Charles outlined the proposal we had been discussing for weeks: a substantial equity investment, operational oversight in several key departments, and one important detail that made the room grow slightly quieter when it appeared on the screen: board influence, not majority ownership, not yet, but enough authority to guide strategic decisions moving forward. The board members exchanged thoughtful looks. They needed the money, but accepting outside investors meant something else as well. It meant giving up a portion of control. One of the senior directors leaned forward. He asked the question I had been expecting since the negotiations began. He wanted to know more about the lead investor behind the group, the person providing the majority of the capital for the deal. Charles glanced toward me. This had been carefully planned. The identity of the lead investor was intentionally vague during the early stages of negotiation. In situations like this, anonymity often made discussions easier. Fewer emotional reactions, more focus on numbers. So far, it had worked. But the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. I calmly explained that the investor preferred privacy during the negotiation phase, standard practice in many venture deals. What mattered right now was the structure of the investment and the speed at which we could move. The board seemed willing to accept that explanation. They needed the deal too badly to argue. For the next 2 hours, we discussed details: ownership percentages, debt restructuring timelines, operational improvements that could restore profitability within 2 years. By the time the meeting ended, something important had shifted. The board was ready. They wanted to move forward. Charles walked me toward the elevator as the others gathered their papers behind us. He seemed relieved. He said that the company had been searching for the right investor for months. Someone with both capital and experience guiding companies through complicated transitions. I nodded politely. Then he asked a casual question: whether I planned to stay in town for Thanksgiving while the legal teams finalized paperwork. I told him I would, because tomorrow night my family would be gathering for their traditional dinner, the same dinner I hadn't been invited to attend. Charles smiled politely, unaware of the strange tension hiding inside that statement. But by the time Thanksgiving evening arrived, the investment deal would already be in motion. And the moment my family discovered who was behind it, the entire celebration would take a very different direction. Part 5, Thanksgiving morning, arrived with the quiet heaviness of late autumn. The town looked exactly the way it always had on holidays. Empty streets, grocery store parking lots filled with last-minute shoppers, houses glowing with warm kitchen lights while families prepared meals they had cooked the same way for decades. I woke up in a small hotel 15 minutes from my parents' house. It wasn't a fancy place, just a quiet business hotel near the highway. Neutral walls, bland carpet, the soft hum of the heating system pushing away the cold creeping in from outside. I sat near the window with a cup of coffee, watching gray clouds drift slowly across the sky. Somewhere across town, my family was probably already awake. My mother would be preparing her enormous Thanksgiving spread. She approached the holiday like a military operation every year, waking up before sunrise to start cooking dishes that could easily feed 30 people. My father would be reviewing emails from the office, pretending to take the day off while still worrying about the company. And Ethan. Today was supposed to be his day. The engagement celebration had been planned carefully. My brother and his fiancée had dated for years, and the announcement was expected to be the highlight of the evening dinner. Relatives were flying in from several states, Old family friends would attend. My parents had even rented a large event tent to extend the dining area behind the house. All of it carefully planned. All of it happening without me. My phone buzzed softly on the table. A message from Charles Denton. The legal team had finalized the first stage of the investment agreement earlier that morning. The board had already reviewed it and signaled approval. Formal signing would happen within the next 48 hours. Technically, the deal was already moving forward. The moment those documents were completed, our investment group would become the largest external shareholder in Harper Industrial Solutions, lead investor, me. I read through the message twice before setting the phone down. Strangely, I didn't feel triumphant. If anything, the situation felt surreal. For years, my family had treated my career like a strange hobby that would eventually fade. Something temporary before I returned to a normal job. Meanwhile, the skills they dismissed were the very reason their company now depended on outside capital. Life had a strange sense of timing. By mid-afternoon, I drove across town, not toward my parents' house, toward the company headquarters. Several employees were still working despite the holiday. Production schedules didn't pause easily in manufacturing. Trucks moved in and out of the loading docks while the cold wind carried the metallic smell of machinery through the air. I parked across the street again. The building looked different today. Knowing what I knew about the company's financial situation changed the way everything appeared. The trucks, the workers, the quiet tension behind a business trying to stay profitable in a difficult market. This place represented my father's entire life, and soon, whether he liked it or not, I would have a say in its future. I sat there for several minutes before driving away. Dusk was beginning to settle across the town as I headed toward the neighborhood where I grew up. The streets became more familiar with every turn. The park where Ethan and I played baseball as kids. The grocery store where my mother still insisted on shopping every weekend. Finally, the large house at the end of Maple Ridge Drive appeared through the trees. My parents' home. Cars were already filling the driveway and lining both sides of the street. Voices and laughter drifted from the backyard tent, glowing with warm lights. The engagement party had clearly started. I parked my car a short distance away and sat there for a moment, watching people walk through the front door carrying desserts and bottles of wine. No one noticed me, which made sense. As far as everyone inside that house knew, I wasn't coming tonight. But what they didn't know was that this dinner was about to become far more interesting than they expected. Because somewhere between the turkey and the engagement announcement, a secret about their company was going to surface. And when it did, every single person in that house would finally understand exactly what I had been doing all these years. Part 6. The house looked brighter than I remembered. Golden lights spilled from the windows, and the large tent stretched across the backyard like something from a wedding reception. My mother had always believed holidays deserved full production value, but this was on another level. Strings of warm lights hung from the tent ceiling. Long tables filled the space. Laughter floated into the cold evening air. The engagement celebration was already in full swing. I sat in the car for a moment longer, watching relatives move through the front door carrying trays of food. Some of them I hadn't seen in years. Others probably didn't even remember the last time we spoke. For a strange second, an old instinct told me to simply drive away. Avoid the awkwardness. Avoid the inevitable looks. But that version of me belonged to another time. So I stepped out of the car. Cold air brushed across my face as I walked slowly toward the house. Gravel crunched under my shoes. Through the windows, I could see silhouettes moving around the living room. Someone had turned on music. A faint hum of conversation floated outside, mixed with the clinking of glasses and bursts of laughter. The front door was slightly open. I pushed it gently and stepped inside. The smell of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and baked bread filled the air immediately. It was the same scent that had defined every Thanksgiving of my childhood. For a moment, I simply stood there, absorbing the familiar chaos. Relatives moved through the hallway carrying dishes toward the backyard. My aunt was arguing with someone about where to place the desserts. Cousins were taking photos near the staircase. Then someone noticed me. My cousin Daniel froze halfway through pouring himself a drink. His eyebrows lifted slowly as recognition settled in. He hadn't expected to see me tonight. A few seconds passed before he forced a small smile and walked over. He asked when I arrived in town. His voice carried the careful tone people use when they aren't sure if someone belongs at the event. Before I could answer, another relative turned and spotted me. Then another. Conversations began slowing down around the room. The subtle shift spread like a ripple. It wasn't hostility, just confusion. Because as far as anyone knew, I wasn't supposed to be here. My aunt approached next, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. Her smile looked slightly strained as she asked if I had just decided to drop by unexpectedly. I nodded casually. I said I was in town for work and thought I might stop in to say hello. The explanation floated in the air for a moment. Technically true, just incomplete. She hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond, then gestured toward the backyard where the rest of the family had gathered. The tent glowed warmly against the cold night outside. As I stepped through the back door, the noise of the celebration swelled instantly. Conversations overlapped. Glasses clinked. Someone was telling a loud story near the buffet table. At the center of it all stood Ethan. My brother looked exactly the same as he had the last time I saw him in person. Confident posture, relaxed smile, one arm around his fiancée while he spoke to a small circle of relatives. The golden sun. Everything about the evening revolved around him. It took him a few seconds to notice me. When he did, his expression froze. Not anger, not happiness either. Just pure surprise. The kind that happens when someone walks into a scene they weren't expected to enter. The conversation around him slowed as people realized where he was looking. Dozens of eyes turned toward me. My mother was standing near the long dining table arranging plates when she finally saw me. The plate slipped slightly in her hands. For a moment, the entire tent felt unusually quiet. My family hadn't invited me to this celebration, and yet here I was, standing right in the middle of it. No one had asked the obvious question yet, but the tension in the air made one thing very clear. My arrival had already changed the atmosphere of the night, and the real surprise hadn't even begun yet. Part 7. For a few long seconds, no one moved. The music continued playing softly from the speakers in the corner of the tent, but the laughter that had filled the space only moments earlier had faded into a strange, suspended silence. My mother was the first to react. She set the plate down slowly on the table and walked toward me with the careful smile she used whenever unexpected situations appeared in front of guests. It wasn't anger exactly. It was the quiet panic of someone trying to keep a scene from forming. She asked when I arrived. Her voice sounded calm, but there was a tightness behind it. The kind that suggested she was already calculating how to explain my presence to everyone else. I told her earlier that afternoon that I was in town for work, that I thought it might be nice to stop by and see everyone. The words floated between us, simple and harmless on the surface. But both of us knew they didn't answer the real question hanging in the air. Why wasn't I invited? Before she could respond, Ethan approached. My brother moved through the small crowd with the same confident energy he carried into every room. A glass of wine in one hand, his fiancée walking beside him. The two of them looked like they had stepped directly out of one of those glossy engagement announcements people post online. He stopped a few feet away from me. For a moment, we simply studied each other. It had been years since we stood this close. Ethan finally spoke with a casual tone that almost sounded friendly. He said he didn't realize I was coming to town for Thanksgiving. I nodded and said it was a last-minute trip. That wasn't entirely a lie. His fiancée smiled politely, though I could tell she was studying the tension between us. She had met me only once before, years ago at another family gathering. Back then, I had been the odd sibling chasing tech investments in California. To her, that version of me probably still existed. Around us, relatives slowly resumed their conversations, though many of them continued glancing in our direction. My father appeared a moment later from the other side of the tent. He had clearly heard about the unexpected arrival. Age had added a few more lines to his face, but his posture remained the same strong, steady presence that had always defined him. The kind of man who built companies and expected the world to behave logically in response. He stopped beside Ethan. His eyes rested on me for a moment before he spoke. He said it had been a long time. His voice wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. Just measured. I agreed. Another pause followed. Then my father asked the question everyone had been wondering since I walked through the door. He asked what kind of work had suddenly brought me back to town. For a brief second, the entire tent seemed to lean closer to the conversation. I shrugged lightly and said, I had been attending meetings with a company nearby, technically true again. My uncle, who had wandered close enough to overhear, chuckled and asked if that meant I had finally found a stable job somewhere. A few relatives laughed politely, the same kind of laughter I remembered from years ago. It wasn't cruel, just familiar. Someone else asked if I was still involved with startup investments. The tone suggested the word investment carried the same meaning as gambling. I nodded. Yes, still working in that field. My uncle grinned and said, hopefully things had improved since the last time we talked about my career. Another small wave of laughter moved through the nearby tables. For a moment, I simply looked around the tent, at the relatives who had spent years dismissing what I did, at the house where every Thanksgiving ended with some variation of the same quiet judgment. Then I looked back at my father. He asked again what company had brought me to town. This time I answered. I said I had been meeting with Harper Industrial Solutions. The name landed gently in the air. My father frowned slightly. Ethan tilted his head. My uncle stopped smiling. Because Harper Industrial Solutions wasn't just any company. It was our company. My father asked why an investment firm from California would be meeting with them. The question carried the faintest hint of suspicion. I held his gaze for a moment before answering. I said my firm had been reviewing several potential investments recently, and Harper Industrial Solutions had become one of the most interesting opportunities. The silence that followed was much heavier than the one when I first arrived, because for the first time that evening, my family realized the reason I was in town might have something to do with them. Part 8. The air inside the tent shifted in a way that only people who have known each other for decades can recognize. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but something subtle had changed. My father studied me more carefully now. The casual curiosity in his expression had been replaced by a quiet calculation. The businessman inside him had clearly heard something in my words that the rest of the family hadn't fully processed yet. Harper Industrial Solutions wasn't a company outsiders casually reviewed, especially not investment firms from the West Coast. Ethan broke the silence first. He gave a small laugh and said that was interesting, because the company had been doing just fine without needing outside investors. His tone carried the same relaxed confidence he used whenever a conversation drifted into territory he believed he understood better than everyone else. Several relatives nodded along. My uncle added that our family business had survived 30 years without venture capital people interfering. That word again, venture capital. The way he said it made it sound like a strange hobby practiced by people who didn't understand real work. A few chuckles circled the table. I didn't argue. Instead, I simply picked up a glass of water from the table and took a slow sip. My father finally spoke again. He said the company had indeed been exploring a few financial restructuring options recently, but those conversations were private. His eyes stayed fixed on me as he spoke, trying to determine how much I actually knew. That was the moment I realized something important. He hadn't been told. The board had kept the negotiations extremely quiet, even from him. I nodded thoughtfully. Then I said that made sense. In situations involving outside capital, confidentiality was usually necessary during early stages, especially when a company was trying to restructure debt and stabilize its expansion plans. The reaction around the table was immediate. My father's expression hardened slightly. Ethan's relaxed posture shifted. My uncle stopped smiling completely. Because those details weren't public, they came directly from internal financial discussions. My father asked how I knew about the company's restructuring plans. The question came out slower this time, carefully measured. Several relatives nearby had stopped talking entirely now. Conversations at the other end of the tent continued, but the small circle around our table had grown unusually quiet. I placed the glass back down on the table. There was no need to rush. Moments like this were always more powerful when allowed to unfold naturally. So I explained calmly that my firm had been reviewing Harper Industrial Solutions' financial reports for several weeks. The board had been looking for a strategic investment partner to strengthen the company's position moving forward. My cousin Daniel blinked. My aunt frowned. Ethan crossed his arms. My father asked which firm I was representing. I told him the name of the investment group. It was a legitimate firm, well known enough in financial circles, though not famous outside that world. None of my relatives recognized it, except my father. His eyes narrowed slightly. He clearly understood the scale of capital firms like that controlled, but something still didn't add up. Finally, he asked the obvious question. If my firm was evaluating Harper Industrial Solutions, why exactly was I involved in those meetings? It was a reasonable question. After all, as far as my family knew, I was just the younger son who left town chasing tech ideas. Someone who occasionally visited, but never quite fit into the serious business conversations. The entire table was watching me now. Even Ethan's fiancée leaned forward slightly. Everyone waiting for the explanation. I gave a small shrug. Then I told them the simplest version of the truth. I said I wasn't just involved in the meetings, I was leading them. For a brief moment, the words didn't fully register. My uncle chuckled automatically, assuming it was some kind of joke. Ethan smiled faintly, clearly expecting a punchline, but my father didn't laugh. He simply stared at me. And in that moment, I could see the first real crack forming in the version of me they had believed in for years. Because if what I had just said was true, then the person they had dismissed at countless family dinners might suddenly be standing on the other side of their company's future. Part 9. For several seconds, the only sound at our table was the faint hum of the heaters keeping the tent warm against the November cold. My uncle was still smiling, but the expression had become slightly uncertain, like someone who laughed too early at a joke and was now waiting to see if anyone else joined in. No one did. Ethan studied my face carefully. He had always been good at reading people. It was one of the traits that made him successful inside the company. Negotiations, contracts, supplier relationships, those things depended on understanding when someone was bluffing. Right now, he was trying to decide if I was. My father spoke again. He asked what exactly I meant when I said I was leading the meetings. The tone wasn't hostile, but it wasn't casual either. It was the voice he used during serious business discussions. I answered simply. I said the investment group I mentioned had been evaluating Harper Industrial Solutions for a potential capital partnership. Over the past month, I had been the primary person communicating with the board. Across the table, my aunt looked confused. My cousin Daniel slowly lowered the glass he had been holding. Ethan leaned back slightly and crossed his arms. He said that was interesting because he had attended several internal leadership meetings recently, and no one mentioned that my name was involved in the negotiations. That made sense, I nodded, Because the board hadn't shared that detail yet, his eyebrows pulled together. Then he asked the next question. If I was supposedly involved in these discussions, what exactly was my role at this investment firm? My uncle chimed in again with a grin, saying maybe I had become some kind of consultant now. A few relatives chuckled politely. Old habits, old assumptions. I let the silence stretch a few seconds before answering. Then I explained that the investment group wasn't just evaluating the company. We were preparing to move forward. The board had already reviewed the proposed deal structure earlier that day. That statement landed differently. Even relatives who didn't fully understand business negotiations could hear the weight inside those words. My father's eyes narrowed slightly. He asked what kind of deal structure we were discussing. I told him the basics. A significant capital investment to stabilize the company's financial position, operational restructuring to improve efficiency in several departments, and board-level influence to guide future strategic decisions. Ethan gave a small laugh. Not dismissive this time, more skeptical. He said companies like ours didn't usually give outside investors that level of influence unless they were desperate. The word hung in the air for a moment. Desperate. My father didn't correct him, which told me everything I needed to know. They both understood the situation better than they wanted to admit. I kept my voice calm. I said every growing company reached moments where strategic partnerships became useful, especially after aggressive expansions, especially when certain financial pressures started building behind the scenes. My uncle frowned slightly. He clearly didn't enjoy hearing the family business described that way in front of relatives. Ethan tapped his fingers against the table. Then he asked something that made the tension tighten again. He asked if I was claiming to represent the group that planned to invest in Harper Industrial Solutions. I looked at him directly, then I shook my head. Not represent. Lead. The difference seemed small at first, but in the context of everything we were discussing, it carried enormous weight. My father's voice came out slower this time. He asked if I was saying that I personally had the authority to approve this investment deal. I held his gaze. Then I answered with a calm honesty that left no room for misunderstanding. I said the investment group had several partners involved, but the majority of the capital was coming from one source, the lead investor. And that investor had already decided the company was worth saving. The table had grown completely silent now. Even the distant conversations across the tent seemed quieter somehow. My father asked the final question. He asked who the lead investor was. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I glanced around the table at the faces that had spent years dismissing the strange career I chose. Then I looked back at him and said the truth. The lead investor was sitting right here at the table. Part 10. For a moment, the words didn't seem to belong to the room. The heaters hummed softly above us. Glasses clinked somewhere farther down the tent. A distant burst of laughter came from the dessert table where cousins were arguing about pumpkin pie. But at our table, everything had frozen. My uncle blinked first. Then he gave a short laugh, shaking his head like someone brushing away a joke that had gone slightly too far. He said I had always had a strange sense of humor. No one joined his laughter. Ethan didn't smile this time. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on mine as if searching for the exact moment I might break character. He had spent his entire life inside the world of contracts, negotiations, and corporate strategy. People in that world didn't make claims like the one I had just made unless they could back them up. My father still hadn't moved. He was watching me with the same steady focus he used during board meetings when someone presented numbers that didn't quite make sense. Finally, he spoke. He said if what I was implying were true, the board would have already known who they were dealing with. His voice was calm. But beneath it sat the quiet authority of a man who had built a company from the ground up and wasn't accustomed to being surprised inside his own business. I nodded slowly. Then I explained the one detail they were missing. The negotiations hadn't been conducted under my personal name. The investment group represented several partners, and during early stages of financial restructuring, it was common practice for the lead investor to remain anonymous, particularly when the situation involved a family-owned company where emotions might complicate the process. That explanation seemed to land harder than anything else I had said so far. Ethan's posture shifted. My uncle stopped trying to smile. My aunt looked back and forth between us like someone watching a chess match where the next move suddenly mattered. My father asked a very simple question. Why? Why would someone hide their identity during negotiations with a company they were planning to invest millions into? The answer to that question sat quietly in the center of the table. I said sometimes it was easier for business decisions to happen when personal history stayed out of the room, especially if that history involved years of assumptions about someone's abilities. The meaning behind the sentence wasn't subtle. A few relatives nearby pretended not to hear, though their eyes kept drifting toward us. Ethan exhaled slowly. Then he leaned back in his chair again and crossed his arms. He said that was a bold story, but if it were true, there would be paperwork, there would be board confirmations, there would be legal agreements with actual names attached. He said companies didn't hand over ownership stakes based on Thanksgiving dinner conversations. That earned a small murmur of agreement from my uncle. Finally, something Ethan said sounded familiar to them again. Real business required proof. I nodded. Of course it did. Then I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. A few quick taps brought up the message Charles Denton had sent earlier that morning. I turned the screen slightly toward my father and Ethan. The email header alone was enough to make Ethan lean forward again. Charles Denton. Subject line: Harper Industrial Solutions Investment Approval, Preliminary Confirmation. My father's eyes scanned the visible lines quickly. He didn't ask to hold the phone. He didn't need to. The tone of the email was unmistakable. It referenced board discussions from earlier that day. It referenced the lead investor. And at the bottom of the message, one line stood out clearly enough for everyone sitting nearby to read. Looking forward to finalizing signatures with you this week. My uncle frowned. Ethan stared at the screen a few seconds longer before looking back at me. His voice was quieter now. He asked how much capital this investment involved. I locked the phone again and slid it back into my pocket. Then I answered, enough to become the largest external shareholder in Harper Industrial Solutions. The silence that followed felt very different from the earlier ones, because this time, no one was laughing anymore. Part 11. The shift in atmosphere spread slowly across the table like the moment before a storm when the air becomes strangely heavy. No one spoke for several seconds. My uncle, who had spent most of the evening joking about my career, suddenly seemed very interested in the condensation forming on his glass. My aunt looked toward the buffet table as if considering whether she should quietly excuse herself. Ethan was the first to recover. He leaned back again, though the movement carried less confidence than before. His fingers tapped lightly against the wooden edge of the table while his mind clearly ran through possibilities. Then he said something that made a few nearby relatives nod in agreement. He said emails could be misleading. Anyone could show a message on a phone. Real deals required contracts, board votes, lawyers, signatures. In other words, proof. I nodded. That was fair. Major investments didn't appear out of thin air. But the interesting thing about negotiations was timing. Certain information became public only after specific steps were completed. And tonight happened to sit right between two of those steps. My father finally spoke again. His voice was calm, but I could hear the careful pressure behind it. He asked when exactly these discussions with the board had started. The question carried more weight than it sounded like, because if the negotiations had been happening for weeks or months, it meant something very unusual. It meant the board had been discussing the company's future with someone outside the family without telling the family. I answered honestly, about a month ago. That response landed like a small stone dropped into still water. Ethan's head tilted slightly. My father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A month. That meant several board meetings had already happened. Several financial reports had been shared, and none of it had reached them. My uncle leaned forward now, curiosity overpowering skepticism. He asked how much ownership the investment group expected in exchange for the capital. That question sounded casual, but every business owner knows it's the one that matters most. Ownership determines control. Control determines the future. I explained the structure briefly. Not a majority stake, but enough equity to become the largest external shareholder. And one additional condition: board influence. The moment I said those words, Ethan's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice, because Ethan understood corporate structure better than anyone else sitting here. Board influence meant something very specific. It meant seats at the table where strategic decisions were made. My father slowly folded his hands together. Then he asked whether the board had already approved this proposal. Another honest answer: yes. Earlier that day, they had given preliminary approval to move forward. Formal signatures would happen within 48 hours. My cousin Daniel quietly whispered something to his wife. My aunt finally stood up and said she needed to check on the desserts. Around us, several relatives pretended to return to their conversations, but the tension at our table had clearly become the most interesting part of the evening. My father remained very still. Then he asked a question that revealed exactly what he was thinking. He asked whether this investment would give the lead investor a seat on the board. The heater above us clicked softly as it cycled on. I nodded. Yes, it would. That answer settled heavily between us, because Harper Industrial Solutions had always been more than a business to my father. It was his legacy, his life's work. And now an outside investor was preparing to sit at the same table where he and Ethan made decisions about its future. Ethan finally spoke again, but this time the confidence had faded from his voice. He asked one final question. If all of this was true, why hadn't the board told them who the lead investor was? I held his gaze for a moment. Then I gave him the same answer I had given earlier. Because sometimes it's easier to negotiate when people don't realize who they're negotiating with. And sometimes the person they underestimate turns out to be the one holding the most leverage. Part 12. The dinner finally began, but the celebration my parents had planned was no longer the same. The long tables under the tent filled with relatives carrying plates stacked with turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, and the dozens of dishes my mother insisted on preparing every year. The familiar ritual unfolded exactly as it always had, except now, every conversation seemed slightly distracted. People kept glancing toward our side of the table. The earlier laughter had returned, but it carried a layer of curiosity underneath. News travels quickly in families, especially when it involves money and power. Someone had already whispered enough pieces of the story for speculation to begin spreading. At the head of the table, my father carved the turkey with precise, deliberate movements. He had always taken that role during Thanksgiving dinners, a small tradition that symbolized control over the evening. Tonight, his focus seemed sharper than usual. Ethan sat beside him, quietly scrolling through his phone between conversations with relatives. I could almost see the calculations happening behind his eyes. He was probably checking company emails, messages from colleagues, maybe even trying to contact someone from the board. No replies yet. The board members who attended the meeting earlier today were likely enjoying their own holiday dinners, unaware that a small storm had already started forming inside the Harper family tent. My mother tried her best to restore the warm mood of the evening. She asked cousins about their jobs. She complimented someone's casserole. She reminded everyone about the engagement announcement planned later in the night. But every time someone mentioned the company or anything related to business, the air grew slightly tighter. Halfway through the meal, my uncle couldn't hold his curiosity any longer. He leaned across the table and asked the question that had clearly been sitting in his mind since our earlier conversation. He wanted to know how someone in venture investments suddenly ended up funding a manufacturing company in the Midwest. A few relatives chuckled politely. To them, it probably did sound unusual. I explained that good investors rarely limit themselves to one industry. Opportunities appeared in many places, especially when established companies face temporary financial pressure. My uncle nodded slowly. Then he said something that made several people glance toward my father. He said Harper Industrial Solutions had always been stable, solid, reliable. My father didn't look up from his plate, but Ethan answered instead. He said every company experienced cycles. Expansion sometimes required outside capital to move faster. The response sounded carefully neutral, a safe explanation for relatives who didn't need to know the deeper details. Across the table, my cousin Daniel finally asked the obvious question. If my firm invested in the company, what exactly would that mean for the family? The words hung in the air. Because behind that question sat something much larger. Would the Harper company still truly belong to the Harpers? I kept my voice calm. I said the investment would strengthen the company, provide resources to improve operations, pay down certain debts, and support future growth. But partnerships always involved shared influence. Strategic decisions would eventually include input from the investment group. My uncle frowned slightly. Then he asked who from the investment group would actually sit on the board. The tent felt quiet again. Even the clatter of forks against plates seemed softer. I didn't rush the answer. Moments like this didn't require dramatic delivery. They just needed honesty. So I told him the board seat would belong to the lead investor, the same person providing most of the capital. Several relatives looked at each other. They already suspected what was coming, but hearing it spoken clearly still felt different. My uncle cleared his throat. Then he asked whether that meant I would be joining the Harper Industrial Solutions board. Across the table, my father finally looked up. Ethan's phone stopped moving in his hands. Every eye near the center of the table turned toward me. I nodded once. Yes, if the final agreements were signed this week, I would become the newest member of the company's board of directors. And suddenly, the Thanksgiving dinner my family planned to celebrate Ethan's future had quietly turned into a conversation about mine. Part 13. For the rest of the meal, conversation moved in cautious circles. No one openly challenged what I had said, but the atmosphere had shifted into something quieter and far more analytical. My family had always been comfortable discussing business. Numbers, contracts, expansion plans, those topics had filled dinner conversations for most of my childhood. But tonight, the dynamic felt different. Because this time, I wasn't just listening from the edge of the table. I was part of the equation. My mother continued trying to guide the evening back towards celebration. She asked Ethan's fiancée about the wedding plans, complimented the decorations, and reminded everyone that the engagement toast would happen after dessert. Yet, even those conversations kept drifting back toward the company. My cousin Daniel asked what board meetings were like. My uncle wanted to know how investment groups usually worked with family businesses. A few relatives seemed impressed. Others looked unsure whether they should treat the situation as good news or a potential problem. At the far end of the table, Ethan remained mostly quiet. That alone was unusual. Growing up, Ethan had always been the most confident voice during discussions about Harper Industrial Solutions. He understood the company better than anyone except my father. For years, it had been obvious that he would eventually take over leadership. But now something complicated had entered the picture. Outside influence. Board oversight. And that influence apparently belonged to the younger brother who once struggled to explain his career at family dinners. After plates were cleared and dessert appeared, guests began standing and moving around the tent again. Conversations broke into smaller groups, while people filled their glasses with wine or coffee. The engagement toast was approaching. My mother clinked a spoon gently against her glass to gather attention. Everyone slowly returned to their seats. She stood at the center of the table with the warm pride only parents possess during milestones like this. Her speech was exactly what you'd expect. Stories from Ethan's childhood, praise for the couple, excitement about the future. It was sincere, heartfelt, and for a few minutes, the tension from earlier faded. Ethan stood beside his fiancée while relatives applauded and raised their glasses. My father even smiled. Then Ethan began his own short speech. He thanked everyone for coming, thanked our parents for their support, thanked his fiancée for believing in him during the years he spent building his career at the company. He spoke confidently again now, the familiar version of Ethan returning as he described his plans for the future. The wedding next year. Expanding Harper Industrial Solutions into new markets. Continuing the family legacy his father had built. Several relatives nodded proudly. But near the end of his speech, something interesting happened. Ethan glanced toward me, just briefly. Then he said something that sounded casual, but clearly wasn't. He mentioned that families sometimes faced unexpected changes, that businesses evolved over time, especially when new partners entered the picture. His voice remained calm, though the message underneath was obvious. He was ignoring earlier conversation without fully confronting it. A diplomatic move. Applause followed when he finished. Glasses clinked again. Music resumed. The party continued. But when people began moving toward the dessert table and smaller conversations resumed, Ethan walked directly toward me. This time, without an audience gathering around us, he stopped a few feet away. His voice was low enough that only I could hear. He said, "If what I told everyone earlier was true, then we needed to talk privately. Not as brothers, as business partners. Because if I really was about to join the board of Harper Industrial Solutions, then the power structure inside the company was about to change." And Ethan wanted to understand exactly what that meant. Part 14. We stepped away from the tent and into the cold. The noise of the party faded behind us as we walked across the backyard toward the darker edge of the property. The grass was damp from the early evening frost, and the distant glow of the house lights barely reached the old oak tree near the fence. For years, this backyard had hosted every family gathering imaginable. Birthdays, barbecues, graduation parties. Ethan and I used to run across this lawn as kids while our parents sat on the patio talking with neighbors. Tonight, it felt like neutral ground. Ethan stopped first. He slid his hands into his coat pockets and studied me for several seconds before speaking. Up close, the confident expression he wore during the engagement toast had faded again. What remained was the version of him I remembered from difficult negotiations, focused, direct, unwilling to waste time. He said he had already checked his email while we were inside. There were messages from the company's finance department confirming that the board had indeed held a meeting earlier that morning, a private one, without him. That detail clearly bothered him, but it wasn't the part that mattered most. The part that mattered was the agenda of that meeting. Capital restructuring, outside investment, lead investor. He exhaled slowly, the cold air forming a small cloud in front of him. Then he asked the question that had probably been forming in his mind since the dinner conversation began. Was I telling the truth? Not the vague version meant for relatives around the dinner table. The real version. Was I actually the lead investor behind the deal the board was negotiating? I didn't hesitate. Yes. For a few seconds, Ethan said nothing. He looked back toward the glowing tent where our family continued celebrating his engagement. Laughter drifted faintly across the yard. Finally, he turned back to me. He said the company wasn't some struggling startup looking for rescue capital. It was our father's life's work. He asked why I would involve myself in something like this without telling the family first. I leaned against the wooden fence and gave the same answer I had given earlier. Because negotiations work better when people focus on numbers instead of history. Ethan shook his head slightly. He said that wasn't the real reason. The real reason, according to him, was something else entirely. Revenge. The word hung between us. He said, I had spent years feeling dismissed by the family. Years watching him step into the role everyone assumed he would inherit. Years hearing relatives joke about my career choices. Now suddenly I had the opportunity to walk back into town holding financial leverage over the company. From his perspective, the situation probably looked simple. You finally found a way to prove everyone wrong. I let him finish. Then I told him something he clearly hadn't expected to hear. I said the company actually needed the investment. His eyes narrowed. Not desperately, but enough that the board had started exploring options months ago. Equipment upgrades had stretched capital reserves. Several large contracts were delayed. Debt payments were scheduled too aggressively. Nothing catastrophic yet. But if the company wanted to expand and remain competitive, new capital was the fastest solution. Ethan didn't argue with that part, which told me he already knew. Instead, he asked the question that really mattered. If I became the largest external shareholder, how much influence would I actually have? I answered honestly. 1 board seat. Voting rights. Strategic input on major decisions, the standard structure for deals like this. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Because he understood exactly what that meant. For the first time in the company's history, someone outside the Harper family would sit at decision-making table. And that someone happened to be the younger brother everyone used to laugh at during Thanksgiving dinners. Ethan looked back toward the house again. Then he asked something much quieter, something that carried far more weight than any financial question. He asked whether I planned to use that influence against the family, because if I did, this Thanksgiving dinner might be the beginning of a much bigger fight. Part 15. The wind moved quietly through the trees behind the house, carrying the distant sound of laughter from the tent. Inside, the celebration was continuing without us. Glasses clinking, music playing, relatives probably debating which pie was better. Out here, everything felt colder. Ethan waited for my answer. His question hung in the air longer than either of us expected. Would I use my position against the family? It was a fair concern. From his perspective, the entire situation probably looked like a carefully planned ambush. The brother who left town years ago had suddenly returned with enough financial power to insert himself directly into the company's leadership. I could understand why that felt threatening, but the truth was far less dramatic. I told him I didn't invest in companies to destroy them. I invested to make them stronger. Ethan studied my face, searching for signs of sarcasm or hidden meaning. When he didn't find any, he shifted his weight slightly and crossed his arms. Then he said something honest. He said the board had always been cautious about outside investors because once someone entered the room with capital, they eventually wanted influence. Influence turned into control. Control turned into change. And change rarely happened quietly in family businesses. I nodded, that was true. But I also reminded him of something else. Companies that refuse to evolve often struggle to survive long term. Harper Industrial Solutions had grown successfully for 30 years, but the market was changing. Technology, supply chains, automation, everything was shifting faster than before. New capital could help the company adapt instead of falling behind. Ethan didn't disagree with that either. Instead, he asked a more personal question. Why this company? Of all the investment opportunities in the world, why choose the one connected to a family that had spent years dismissing my career? I looked toward the glowing tent where our relatives continued celebrating. Because despite everything, the answer was simple. it was still my family's company. I grew up hearing conversations about production lines, supplier contracts, and expansion strategies at the dinner table. I watched my father build something real from nothing. That kind of legacy mattered, even if the people involved didn't always understand each other. Ethan exhaled slowly. The tension between us softened slightly. Not gone, but different. Then he asked something more practical. Did our father know the truth yet? I shook my head. Not completely. He knew an investment group was negotiating with the board. He knew a lead investor existed, but he didn't know the identity behind that investor. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. He said our father wasn't going to like that. Probably not. Family businesses carried pride that extended beyond financial success. Control mattered. Authority mattered. Discovering that the board had quietly negotiated with his younger son behind his back was not exactly the kind of Thanksgiving surprise my father would appreciate. Ethan glanced back toward the tent again. Then he said something interesting. He said the board must have believed the deal was extremely important if they were willing to keep it from both him and our father. I didn't confirm or deny that directly, but the implication was clear. Sometimes board members acted in the company's best interest, even when that meant making decisions the founding family might resist emotionally. Ethan let that idea settle for a moment. Then he looked back at me with a new kind of seriousness. He said if I really was about to become part of the company's leadership, then we needed to establish one thing right now. Clear boundaries, because inside the boardroom we might become partners. But outside it, we were still brothers. The question was whether those two roles could exist at the same time. Before I could answer, the back door of the house opened. Warm light spilled across the yard, and our father stepped outside, clearly looking for us. Part 16. The back door closed behind my father with a quiet thud. Warm light from the kitchen stretched across the frost-covered grass, stopping just short of where Ethan and I stood near the fence. For a moment, the three of us simply looked at one another across the cold space of the backyard. From inside the tent, someone had started another round of music. Laughter rose again as relatives continued the celebration. But my father wasn't paying attention to any of that. His eyes moved slowly between us. Then he walked closer. He didn't rush. He never rushed. My father had always been the kind of man who approached problems like machinery, methodically, carefully, examining every moving piece before deciding what to do. When he reached us, he folded his arms against the cold and looked directly at me. He said the dinner conversation had raised some interesting questions. That was his way of putting it. Ethan shifted slightly beside me but stayed silent. My father continued. He said Ethan had told him what I claimed earlier at the table, that I was involved in the investment discussions with the board, that I believed I was about to become the lead investor in Harper Industrial Solutions. He paused there. The night air felt heavier somehow. Then he asked the same question Ethan had asked earlier. Was it true? I didn't hesitate. Yes. The word came out calm and steady. My father's expression didn't change immediately. He simply studied me for several seconds, the same way he used to examine blueprints in his office when something didn't add up. Finally, he spoke again. He said the board had indeed been discussing outside capital recently. The company had expanded quickly over the past 2 years. New machinery, new contracts, larger payroll commitments. Growth required resources, but the board had assured him they were only exploring possibilities. Nothing finalized, nothing decided. I nodded slightly. That was technically correct. Earlier stages of negotiation rarely involved final commitments. My father then asked the question that mattered most to him. Why hadn't the board told him who the lead investor was? There was no accusation in his voice, but there was something else. Hurt. Not dramatic, just quiet disappointment. Because the company wasn't just business to him. It was 30 years of work, 30 years of decisions, 30 years of building something he believed the family would carry forward. And now it seemed the board had been holding conversations about its future without him fully informed. I answered carefully. I said the board had likely wanted to confirm the financial structure before introducing personalities into the situation, especially when those personalities might complicate negotiations. Ethan gave a small, humorless laugh beside me. My father ignored him. His attention stayed on me. Then he asked something that revealed exactly what was happening inside his mind. If this investment moved forward, what exactly would I gain? The question wasn't about money, it was about control, about authority, about the balance of power inside the company he created. I explained the structure simply: capital investment, equity share, one seat on the board, strategic input moving forward. My father listened without interrupting. When I finished, he looked past us toward the tent where the family celebration continued. Then he said something quietly. He said he had spent most of his life teaching Ethan how to run the company one day, teaching him the values behind it, the risks, the responsibility of employing hundreds of people in this town. He turned back to me. Then he asked the question that neither Ethan nor I had fully addressed yet. If I truly believed in the company enough to invest in it, why hadn't I come to him first? The answer sat somewhere between pride, history, and years of misunderstanding. Before I could respond, Ethan spoke. He said maybe the real question wasn't why I didn't come to him first. Maybe the real question was whether the company was about to belong to someone else. And for the first time that night, the conversation stopped feeling like family tension and started sounding like a fight over the future of the company itself. Part 17. The cold air between the three of us tightened, not physically, but the way tension does when words shift from curiosity to territory. My father didn't respond to Ethan immediately. He simply stood there, hands tucked under his arms against the cold, eyes resting somewhere beyond us, toward the tent where laughter and music spilled into the yard. Then he exhaled slowly. He said something that neither of us expected. He said companies didn't belong to people. They belonged to the responsibilities people chose to carry. Ethan shook his head. He said that might have been true 30 years ago when the company was still a workshop with 2 welding tables and a rented forklift. But now, it was a regional manufacturer with contracts across 3 states. Now ownership mattered. Now control mattered. My father turned his gaze toward him. There was no anger there, just a tired patience. He said control only mattered to people who believed leadership meant holding power instead of carrying consequences. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but my father lifted a hand slightly. Not to silence him, just to pause the moment. Then he looked back at me and asked again, why didn't I come to him first? The question wasn't about business anymore. It was about trust, about whether I still saw him as someone I could stand beside, or someone I had to work around. For a moment, I considered giving him the clean version of the answer, the diplomatic version. But the cold air had already stripped the conversation of polite edges, so I told him the truth. I said because I didn't think he would listen. Ethan gave a short laugh again, but it sounded sharper this time. My father didn't react. He simply watched me. I told him that every conversation we'd had about the company for the past 10 years ended the same way, with him explaining why Ethan understood the business better, why Ethan had been there from the beginning, why Ethan knew the people, the machinery, the contracts. All of that was true, but it also meant something else. It meant there had never really been space for me in the discussion, not as an equal, not as someone who might see the future differently. My father didn't interrupt while I spoke. When I finished, the music inside the tent shifted to something slower. For a moment, the sound of relatives laughing drifted across the yard again. Then Ethan spoke quietly. He said I was rewriting history. He said the company had never been closed to me. I just chose to leave, chose another career, chose another city, chose to build something outside the family business. He He stepped closer to the fence and said if I wanted to be involved, I could have been, anytime. The implication hung in the air. You walked away, I nodded slightly. That part was also true, but it wasn't the whole story. So I said something neither of them expected. I said walking away was the only way I could ever come back with real leverage. The backyard went completely still. Ethan stared at me like he'd misheard. My father's expression finally shifted. Just slightly. Not anger, recognition. Because he understood what I had just admitted. I hadn't stayed away because I didn't care about the company. I had stayed away because I did. Because if I came back as the younger brother asking for a role, I would always be the younger brother asking for a role. But if I came back as the person financing the company's next stage, the entire balance of the conversation changed. Ethan spoke first. His voice was quieter now, more controlled. He said, if that investment went through, I wouldn't just be involved. I would be sitting across the table from him, voting, influencing decisions, possibly blocking them. I didn't deny it, because that was exactly how boards worked. My father looked between us again, the same slow, thoughtful gaze he'd used his entire life when something complicated sat in front of him. Finally, he said something simple. He said if the board believed this investment was the best move for the company, then he would listen. But if the company turned into a battlefield between his sons, then the investment wouldn't matter. The words settled over the yard. For the first time that night, none of us spoke, and from inside the tent, someone suddenly shouted my name. Apparently, they were about to start the toast, which meant the entire family was about to walk outside looking for us, and none of them had any idea that the future of the company was being decided 20 feet away from the party. Part 18. The voice calling my name came again, louder this time. A few people inside the tent started chanting it playfully, the way families do when someone is about to be dragged into an embarrassing speech. My father glanced toward the tent, then back at Ethan and me. For a brief moment, the three of us stood in silence, aware that whatever was happening in this backyard would soon collide with the celebration inside. Ethan broke the silence first. He said maybe the timing of all this wasn't accidental. I asked what he meant. He gestured toward the house, toward the tent, toward the entire evening. He said showing up tonight, making statements about investing in the company in front of the board members and family, felt less like a conversation and more like a move, a calculated one. My father didn't react to the accusation, but he was listening closely. I answered honestly. I said the board had scheduled the early investment discussions 2 weeks ago. They chose tonight because several of them were already coming into town for the anniversary celebration. Combining business and family was their idea, not mine. Ethan shook his head slightly. He said that might explain the timing, but it didn't explain the message. Because announcing that you might become the lead investor during a family dinner wasn't just information, it was pressure, and everyone at that table had felt it. I thought about that for a moment. He wasn't completely wrong, but pressure worked both ways. I told him the board wouldn't be discussing outside capital at all if the company's current structure wasn't already straining. Rapid growth had created gaps, operational gaps, financial gaps, strategic gaps. Ethan crossed his arms. He said we were handling those. I asked how. He started listing things, new contracts, new equipment, expanded production schedules, all the visible signs of growth. My father finally spoke again, quietly. He said those weren't solutions, those were symptoms. Ethan stopped talking. The words hung there. My father had spent decades building Harper Industrial Solutions, and he knew the difference between expansion and stability better than anyone. He turned to me and asked something much more specific. If the investment moved forward, what exactly did the board believe the company needed to change? Now the conversation had reached the real issue. I told him the truth. The board believed the company needed professional management layers between ownership and operations, a more formal financial structure, long-term capital planning, and possibly expansion beyond regional contracts. Ethan laughed under his breath again, but this time it sounded different. Less amused, more defensive. He said that translated to one thing: outsiders, consultants, executives who had never stepped inside the factory floor trying to tell people how to run it. My father didn't dismiss the concern, but he didn't support it either. Instead, he asked me another question. If I became the lead investor, would I support those changes? The music inside the tent suddenly cut out. Applause followed. Someone had probably finished a toast. Footsteps started moving toward the yard. We didn't have much time before the rest of the family arrived. I met my father's eyes, then Ethan's, and I answered carefully. I said I would support whatever ensured the company survived the next 20 years, even if that meant changing how it had operated for the past 30. Ethan's jaw tightened. My father studied my face again, and just as the back door opened and voices spilled into the yard, he said something that none of us had considered yet. He said the board might believe the future of the company depended on outside capital, but he wasn't convinced the real problem was money. The backyard lights flicked on. Relatives began stepping onto the grass, laughing and holding glasses of champagne. My father looked at both of his sons and said the real question was whether the company's future depended on which one of us was willing to walk away from controlling it. And suddenly, the toast inside the tent wasn't the only speech about to happen that night. Part 19. The first person to step fully into the backyard was my Aunt Linda, holding a half-filled champagne flute and wearing the slightly flushed expression of someone enjoying a celebration that had gone exactly as planned. Behind her came 3 cousins, then Daniel, then my mother. They stopped when they saw us standing near the fence. Not arguing, not shouting, just standing there in a triangle of quiet tension that didn't belong at an engagement party. My aunt tried to lighten the moment immediately. She said everyone was looking for us inside. Ethan's fiancée was about to make a speech, and apparently the brothers were expected to stand nearby for photos afterward. Ethan forced a small smile. My father nodded politely, but none of us moved. Daniel glanced between us, reading the situation faster than the others. His eyes lingered on me a second longer than necessary, as if he already suspected what the rest of the family had not yet realized. My mother stepped forward. She asked what was going on. No one answered. Inside the tent, someone tapped a microphone. The speakers crackled faintly. Then Ethan's fiancée began thanking everyone for coming. The backyard fell into a strange half-silence as the speech drifted through the open tent flaps. Guests inside were listening politely, but the group gathered outside kept their attention on us instead. My father finally broke the pause. He told everyone there was nothing to worry about, just a business discussion that had accidentally followed us outside. My aunt laughed softly and said, of course it had. In this family, business had always followed dinner. But then, Ethan said something that changed the atmosphere instantly. He said it wasn't just a business discussion. It was about who might end up owning the company. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. My mother blinked. My aunt lowered her glass. Daniel exhaled slowly. My father closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in anger, but in quiet recognition that the conversation had just moved into territory he would have preferred to keep private. My mother asked Ethan what he meant. Ethan didn't hesitate. He said the board was looking for outside investors. And apparently one of those investors was standing right here in the backyard. Several pairs of eyes turned toward me. My aunt frowned. My mother looked confused. Daniel looked almost impressed. I didn't say anything. Ethan continued. He explained that I had claimed earlier tonight that I might become the lead investor in Harper Industrial Solutions. My mother laughed nervously. She said that sounded like one of those startup stories I used to talk about years ago, the kind that never really led anywhere. No one joined her laughter, because Daniel spoke next. He said quietly that the board was actually looking for a lead investor. My mother's smile faded. She looked at my father. My father didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either. Inside the tent, Ethan's fiancée finished her speech and guests applauded warmly. The applause felt oddly distant. Out here, the air had shifted. My aunt asked the obvious question. Was I serious? I looked at my father, then at Ethan, then at the small circle of family members now waiting for an answer. And I said yes, not joking, not exaggerating, serious. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. My mother stared at me like she was trying to recalculate years of assumptions all at once. My aunt slowly set her glass down on the patio railing. Daniel folded his arms. Ethan watched me carefully. Finally, my mother asked the question that had probably been sitting in her mind since the moment the conversation began. She asked how someone whose career they barely understood, someone who moved to the city chasing unpredictable ventures, could possibly afford to invest in a company the size of Harper Industrial Solutions. I took a breath, because answering that question meant opening a door I had kept closed for a very long time. And once that door opened, there would be no closing it again. Part 20. The backyard felt smaller after my mother asked the question, not physically smaller. The grass still stretched to the fence, the patio lights still glowed warm against the house, and the music from the tent continued drifting through the cool night air. But the space between everyone standing there had tightened. Attention does that. When enough people focus on one person at once, the air seems to close in around them. My mother was still waiting for an answer. So were the others. My aunt leaned lightly against the railing now, curiosity replacing the cheerful energy she had brought from the party. Daniel watched with the cautious interest of someone who suspected a much larger story was about to unfold. Ethan said nothing, but his eyes hadn't left my face. I answered my mother slowly. I told her that the career they barely understood had been my entire life for the past 8 years. Startups, early stage companies, technology investments, most of them had failed. That part was true, and I didn't hide it. In the early years, I had lost money. More than once, I had nearly run out of it entirely. There were nights when my apartment rent felt like the biggest financial negotiation of the month. Those were the years the family liked to remember. The years that confirmed every joke they made about my internet career. My aunt nodded slightly, as if that sounded more familiar, but I kept going. Because what they never saw were the later years. The years when things began working. When one small investment paid off. Then another. When the people I worked with stopped treating me like the young guy with risky ideas and started treating me like someone who knew how to recognize opportunities before the rest of the market noticed them. Daniel shifted his weight slightly. He understood where this story might be heading. My mother didn't. She asked carefully whether I was saying I had money from those companies. I nodded. Yes, some of them had grown much larger than anyone expected. Ethan spoke for the first time since the question. He said plenty of startups claim success, but investing in a regional manufacturing company required real capital, not internet headlines. His tone wasn't mocking, it was skeptical, and maybe a little defensive. I understood why. Because Harper Industrial Solutions wasn't a small family shop anymore. It employed hundreds of workers across 2 facilities. The equipment alone was worth tens of millions. My father knew that better than anyone. He looked at me again and asked the only number that really mattered. How much? The question cut through the story instantly. Not how successful, not how impressive. Just how much capital I could actually bring to the table. Inside the tent, the band had started playing again. Guests were clapping along, celebrating Ethan and his fiancée, while the rest of the family stood in the backyard, calculating something very different. I answered honestly. I told them the investment fund I worked with had recently closed a deal that freed up significant liquidity, enough to participate in several mid-sized acquisitions. Harper Industrial Solutions happened to fall into that category. My aunt looked startled. My mother looked confused again. Daniel looked like he had just solved a puzzle. But Ethan focused on one specific word: fund. He asked if that meant the money wasn't actually mine. It was a fair question. Most venture capitalists invest other people's capital. I nodded once. Part of it belonged to the fund, but not all of it. The fund allowed partners to co-invest their own capital into deals they personally believed in. And this one, I believed in. My father absorbed that quietly. Years of running a company had trained him to filter emotion out of financial conversations. But I could still see the gears turning in his mind. Equity, board seats, ownership percentages, control. Finally, he asked the next question. If the board accepted the investment, what percentage of the company would change hands? The number had been discussed in meetings for weeks, but saying it out loud here in the backyard of my parents' house during my brother's engagement party felt surreal. I looked at him, then at Ethan, then at the rest of the family gathered in uneasy silence, and I told them, enough equity to become the largest single shareholder outside the founding family. The music from the tent suddenly swelled louder as someone opened the flap wider, but the only sound anyone in the backyard seemed to hear was the quiet realization that the balance of power inside our family business might already be changing. Part 21. The reaction wasn't loud. There was no shouting, no dramatic outburst, no glasses dropped on the patio floor. Instead, the silence deepened. It spread through the small group in the backyard, like cold air settling into a room after someone opens a door in winter. My mother was the first to speak. She said that didn't make sense. Not angrily, not accusingly, just confused. She reminded everyone that Harper Industrial Solutions was a family company. My father had built it from a single workshop. Ownership had always been structured around the idea that it would stay within the family. That had been the assumption for 30 years. I nodded, because she was right. That had always been the plan. My father looked toward the tent again, where guests were laughing and dancing beneath strings of lights. The celebration inside seemed almost surreal compared to the quiet tension outside. Then he looked back at me. He said something carefully. He said the board might discuss outside capital, but selling a major share to anyone, even family, would still require approval from the existing ownership group. In other words, it wasn't automatic. It wasn't guaranteed. Ethan stepped forward slightly. He sounded calmer now, but the edge was still there. He said even if outside investment was necessary, it didn't mean control needed to shift. Companies raise capital all the time without surrendering authority. That was true too. But the board hadn't been discussing a small investment. They had been discussing restructuring, and restructuring changes things. Daniel finally spoke again. He asked my father a question that no one else seemed ready to say out loud. Had the board told him how much capital they believed the company actually needed? My father hesitated, only briefly. But the hesitation answered the question before he spoke. They had. My aunt noticed the pause. She asked how much. My father exhaled slowly. Then he told them. The number landed in the backyard like a quiet explosion. It was far larger than anyone outside the company's leadership had probably imagined. Expansion loans, equipment financing, new contracts that required upfront capacity the company didn't currently have. Growth had moved faster than the company's internal resources. Ethan frowned. He said that didn't mean the solution was bringing in someone new to the ownership structure. There were other options. My father nodded. Yes, there were. But most of those options involve taking on large amounts of debt, and debt carries risk. Daniel looked at me again, then back at my father. He said if the board was considering equity investment instead of loans, that meant they were worried about something deeper than simple expansion. My father didn't answer that directly, but his silence was enough. My mother wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. She said she didn't understand how the conversation had gone from celebrating Ethan's engagement to discussing the future ownership of the company. Ethan gave a short laugh, but it wasn't a happy one. He said maybe the two things weren't as separate as everyone thought. Because if control of the company changed, it could affect everything. His career, the leadership transition my father had always planned, the role he expected to step into one day, the future he had built his life around. The music inside the tent shifted again as the band started another song. A group of relatives cheered somewhere near the dance floor, but outside the atmosphere had grown heavy. My father finally looked directly at me again and asked something much more personal this time. If I really believed the company needed this investment, and if I truly intended to be part of it, why reveal all of this tonight? Why here, at Ethan's engagement dinner, at Thanksgiving, in front of the entire family? The truth was complicated. Part strategy, part timing, part something deeper I had carried for years. Before I could decide how much of that truth to say out loud, the tent flap opened again. This time, almost everyone else followed, and suddenly, the quiet conversation in the backyard wasn't private anymore. Part 22. The backyard filled quickly. At first, it was just a few more cousins wandering out with drinks in hand, curious about why half the family had disappeared from the party. Then came two of my uncles, followed by Ethan's fiancée and several of her friends, all smiling politely as if they expected to find a casual conversation. But the moment they saw the way everyone was standing, spread out, silent, watching the center of the group, the mood shifted. Something serious was happening. My Uncle Robert asked if we were about to start another speech. Daniel shook his head slightly. No one laughed. Inside the tent, the band continued playing, but the sound now felt strangely distant. Guests who remained inside had started noticing that the core of the Harper family had migrated outside. More heads began appearing near the tent opening. My father rubbed his hands together slowly, the way he used to when deciding how to address a difficult meeting at the factory. He hadn't planned for this. None of us had. But sometimes a conversation grows too large to stay contained. Ethan seemed to realize that too. He turned slightly toward the growing crowd and said something before anyone else could control the narrative. He said we had been discussing a potential investment in the company. That sentence alone was enough to trigger a ripple of curiosity. My Uncle Robert asked what kind of investment. My Aunt Linda glanced at me again. My mother still looked unsettled. Ethan didn't hesitate. He said the board had been looking for outside capital to support the company's next phase of expansion. Several relatives nodded approvingly. Expansion sounded good. Growth sounded healthy. But then Ethan added the part that shifted the atmosphere. He said one of the potential lead investors happened to be standing right here with us tonight. Now everyone looked directly at me. A cousin near the patio whispered something under his breath. Another uncle frowned slightly. Ethan's fiancée looked confused. My father sighed quietly, not in frustration, but in the way someone sighs when they realize a moment they hope to delay has officially arrived. Daniel spoke up again. He explained calmly that the company had been evaluating several financial strategies: debt, partnerships, equity investment, nothing unusual for a business at their stage of growth. But the room, well, the backyard, was now waiting for the real question. My Uncle Robert asked it, was this investment serious or just an idea being floated around? I answered simply, serious, very serious. The word hung in the air. Ethan crossed his arms again. He looked at the group and said that if the deal went through, it wouldn't just be a financial partnership. It would involve ownership, board representation, influence over the company's future direction. Now the expressions around us changed because ownership meant something very specific in this family. It meant control. My aunt slowly said that the company had always been meant to stay in Harper hands. My father looked at the ground for a moment before answering. Technically, it still would. That line confused several people, so he clarified. Family ownership would remain, but the structure might evolve, and sometimes evolution meant welcoming partners. Ethan gave a quiet, skeptical chuckle. He said that was one way to describe it. Another way would be saying someone was buying their way into the company. The comment landed harder than he probably intended. My father shot him a quick look, but Ethan didn't back down. He turned toward me again and asked something that everyone else had started wondering too. If the investment actually happened, how much influence would I really have? I met his gaze. Then I answered truthfully, more than he probably expected. The crowd murmured softly. My father looked toward the tent again, as if measuring the distance between the celebration and the conversation that had now taken over the entire evening. Then he said something that brought the focus back to the real issue. None of this would matter unless the board finalized the deal, and that decision hadn't been made yet. Ethan nodded slowly, then he looked back at me and said that might be true, but there was still one question no one had answered. If I truly planned to invest this much into the company, what exactly did I expect in return? And the honest answer to that question was far more complicated than anyone in the backyard was prepared to hear. Part 23. The question lingered in the cold night air. What exactly did I expect in return? Ethan had asked it like a challenge, but the truth was everyone in the backyard wanted the answer. My uncles, my aunts, my mother, even Ethan's fiancée, who had probably imagined tonight ending with dancing and photographs, not a conversation about corporate control. My father watched me carefully. He wasn't angry. He was measuring. For 30 years, he had negotiated contracts, loans, supplier agreements, union discussions. He knew the moment when a conversation stopped being emotional and started becoming strategic. And that moment had arrived. I took a slow breath before answering. I said the return wasn't complicated, not in theory. The investment structure the board was discussing included three main elements: capital injection, equity share, board representation. Most of the relatives nodded as if those words sounded vaguely familiar from business news or documentaries. But Ethan wasn't interested in the textbook version. He said that didn't answer the real question. The real question was what I intended to do with that influence once I had it. My Aunt Linda looked uncomfortable now. She said maybe this wasn't the right place for such a serious conversation. But my Uncle Robert shook his head. He said if someone was about to buy a major stake in the family company, the family probably deserved to understand the situation. Daniel agreed quietly. My father still said nothing. He was letting the discussion unfold. So I answered Ethan directly. I said the board had been discussing several operational changes, professional management layers, financial restructuring, a longer-term capital strategy, and possibly expanding beyond the current regional manufacturing contracts. Ethan's expression tightened, because that list confirmed what he had already feared earlier. Outsiders, corporate restructuring, the kind of changes that slowly transform a company from a family-run operation into something more institutional. He said those weren't small adjustments. Those were fundamental shifts. I nodded. Yes, they were. And they were being discussed because the company had reached a point where continuing exactly as before might limit its future. My father finally spoke again, quietly. He said growth always brings that crossroads. Stay small and stable, or evolve and risk becoming something different. He had faced that decision many times over the years. Sometimes he chose expansion, sometimes he chose caution. Now, the company had reached another version of that same decision. But Ethan wasn't looking at my father anymore. He was looking at me. He said there was still one part missing from the explanation. Motivation. Why this company? Why now? Why invest in the family business after spending years building a completely separate career? My mother watched me closely because she probably wondered the same thing. If I had the capital to invest elsewhere, why come back here? Why complicate everything? The honest answer wasn't something I had ever planned to say out loud in front of everyone, but the moment had already grown larger than the original conversation. So I told them. I said I didn't choose the company because it was family. I chose it because it was undervalued. Several people frowned at that. Ethan laughed once under his breath, but I kept going. The board's financial projections showed strong contracts, reliable demand, and equipment capable of scaling production. But the company's financial structure hadn't evolved as quickly as its operations. That gap created opportunity. In the investment world, opportunity often hides inside businesses that are strong but undercapitalized. Daniel slowly nodded. He understood. My father looked thoughtful, but Ethan's expression darkened slightly. Because what I had just described wasn't a sentimental family decision, it was a business decision. He said something then that cut through the polite tone the conversation had maintained so far. He said if I was approaching the company purely as an investment opportunity, then maybe I wasn't thinking about the same things the rest of the family cared about. Because for him, this company wasn't just an asset, it was the future he had spent years preparing to inherit. The backyard went quiet again, and for the first time that night, the real conflict between us stood fully exposed. Part 24. The silence after Ethan's words carried a different weight than before. Until now, the conversation had been about numbers, structures, and strategy, investment terms, board seats, equity percentages, things that sounded professional, almost clinical. But Ethan had just pulled the discussion somewhere far more personal. Inheritance. That word didn't need to be spoken again. Everyone standing in the backyard understood it immediately. My father had built Harper Industrial Solutions over 3 decades, and the unspoken assumption in the family had always been clear. One day Ethan would run it. Not because anyone formally announced it, because it had always seemed inevitable. He worked there. He learned the operations. He sat in on meetings. He knew the managers, the supervisors, the workers on the factory floor. While I had moved to the city chasing startups and venture deals, Ethan had stayed close to home, slowly positioning himself as the natural successor. So when he said the company was the future he expected to inherit, it didn't sound arrogant to most of the family. It sounded like the logical plan. My mother nodded slightly, almost unconsciously. My aunt folded her arms. Several cousins exchanged glances. Daniel looked at me carefully, waiting to see how I would respond. My father remained still, his expression neutral but attentive. He wasn't interrupting. This was a conversation his sons needed to have. Ethan continued. He said that for years, everyone assumed I had chosen a different path, different industry, different city, different priorities. And that was fine. The family had accepted it. But now, suddenly appearing as a potential lead investor in the very company he had spent years preparing to run, changed that understanding. He looked directly at me and asked the question plainly. Was I trying to take control of the company? The directness of it made several relatives shift uncomfortably. My aunt muttered something about this not being the right time, but no one stopped the conversation. Because the truth was, everyone wanted the answer. I didn't rush it. I looked around the backyard first, at the faces of relatives who had known us both our entire lives. At my mother, who looked torn between concern and confusion. At Daniel, who had probably already guessed more of the truth than the rest. And finally at my father. He wasn't asking the question, but he was listening very carefully. So, I answered Ethan calmly. I said control wasn't the goal, stability was. That answer didn't satisfy him. He said those two things often meant the same thing in business. Whoever provides the capital usually gains influence. Whoever gains influence eventually shapes decisions, and whoever shapes decisions ultimately controls the direction of the company. He wasn't wrong, but the situation wasn't as simple as he imagined. I told him something then that shifted the conversation again. I said the board hadn't approached me because they wanted to replace him. They approached me because they believed the company needed someone who understood both sides of the equation, operations and capital. Ethan frowned. My father tilted his head slightly, so I explained. The board knew Ethan understood the business itself, the factories, the contracts, the production schedules. But scaling the company further required navigating something different. Financial markets, investment structures, expansion capital, and those were areas where my experience happened to be stronger. Daniel gave a small nod again. He could see the logic, but Ethan wasn't convinced. He said that still didn't explain why the board would consider bringing in someone whose interests might not align with the family's long-term control. Before I could answer, my father finally spoke, quietly. He said the board's responsibility wasn't protecting family expectations, it was protecting the company. That sentence landed harder than anything else said so far. Ethan looked at him sharply. My father didn't apologize for it. Instead, he turned to me and asked one final question. If the investment moved forward, if the equity changed hands, if the company began evolving into something larger than the small operation he originally built, would I be willing to make decisions that might not always favor the family? The backyard went completely still, because everyone understood what he was really asking. Would I choose the company's future, even if it meant standing against my own brother? And the answer to that question was the moment everything between us could truly change. Part 25. For several seconds, no one spoke. The question my father had asked hung in the cold air like something fragile and dangerous at the same time. Would I choose the company's future, even if it meant standing against my own brother? The backyard lights hummed softly above us. Somewhere inside the tent, laughter burst from a group of guests who had no idea the center of the Harper family was currently frozen in a moment that could reshape everything. My mother looked between Ethan and me. She had spent most of her life trying to keep peace between people. Even when we were kids, she was the one who stepped in when arguments grew too heated. But this wasn't a childhood disagreement about toys or school grades. This was about power, about legacy, about the future of a company that carried our family name. Ethan hadn't taken his eyes off me. He was waiting, not impatiently, but with a kind of quiet intensity that made it clear he expected the answer to define what happened next. Daniel leaned slightly against the patio railing, watching like someone observing a chess match reach its decisive phase. My Aunt Linda rubbed her hands together nervously. My Uncle Robert took a slow sip from his glass. Everyone was waiting. I answered my father carefully. I said that anyone who invests in a company, family or not, has a responsibility to protect that company's long-term health. That meant making decisions based on what allowed the business to survive and grow, not just what felt comfortable in the moment. Ethan nodded slowly. He said that sounded exactly like something a venture capitalist would say. There was a faint edge of sarcasm in it, but also something else. Recognition. He understood the logic. He just didn't like what it implied. I continued. I said that protecting the company didn't automatically mean opposing the family. In fact, most of the time those two goals aligned. The stronger the company became, the more secure the future was for everyone connected to it. My father listened without interrupting. But Ethan asked the question again in a slightly different form. He said, what happens if those interests don't align? What happens if the board believes one decision strengthens the company, but that same decision weakens the family's control over it? Now the conversation had reached its sharpest point, because every major business eventually faces that exact conflict. Growth versus ownership, capital versus independence. Daniel finally spoke again. He said those kinds of decisions were exactly why boards existed, to force difficult choices into the open. My father nodded slightly, but his attention remained on me, so I answered Ethan's question directly. I said, if a moment like that ever arrived, I would support whatever decision protected the company's future, even if it was unpopular, even if it was difficult, even if some people in the family disagreed. The words sounded calm coming out of my mouth, but I could see the reaction ripple through the group. My mother looked down, my aunt inhaled slowly, my uncle Robert raised his eyebrows. Ethan studied my face carefully, as if searching for hesitation. He didn't find any. Finally, he gave a short nod. Then he said something that made the entire backyard shift again. He said, in that case, the board should probably know something before they finalize any investment deal. My father frowned slightly. He asked what Ethan meant. Ethan glanced around at the family gathered in the yard, then back at me, and he said the board might believe bringing me in as a major investor would strengthen the company's future, but they might not realize it could also create a conflict that divides the leadership of the business itself, because if the deal went through, the company wouldn't just have outside capital for the first time. It would also have two brothers on opposite sides of the same boardroom table. The music inside the tent faded as the band paused between songs. For a moment, the backyard felt completely silent. Then, Ethan added one more sentence. And this time, he wasn't speaking to the family. He was speaking directly to me. He said if I really planned to move forward with the investment, then I should understand something very clearly. This wouldn't just be a business partnership. It would be a fight over the future of the company. And the first round of that fight would begin much sooner than anyone here expected. Part 26. The music inside the tent stopped completely. For a moment, the quiet felt almost unnatural, as if the entire property had paused to listen to what would happen next. Ethan's last words still lingered in the backyard. A fight over the future of the company. Several relatives shifted uneasily. A few of them exchanged glances that carried the same thought. This conversation had gone far beyond a casual family discussion. My father remained still. But I knew that posture well. He was thinking, evaluating. 30 years of building a company had trained him to recognize the moment when something moved from theory into reality. And Ethan had just forced that moment into the open. My mother broke the silence first. She said this wasn't how Thanksgiving was supposed to go. Her voice wasn't angry, just tired. She looked at Ethan, then at me. Two sons standing across from each other like competitors instead of brothers. My Aunt Linda quietly suggested everyone should return to the party before things became more uncomfortable. But Ethan shook his head. He said the party wasn't the problem. The problem was pretending nothing had changed. Because something had changed. Everyone knew it. He turned toward my father, then asked him directly, when was the next board meeting? My father answered automatically, Monday morning. The response came out before he could reconsider saying it in front of the family. Ethan nodded. Then he looked back at me. He said that was perfect timing, because if the board planned to finalize any investment discussions soon, then they deserved to hear both sides of the situation. Daniel frowned slightly. He asked what Ethan meant by both sides. Ethan didn't hesitate. He said the board needed to understand that bringing me in as a lead investor wouldn't just add capital, it would fundamentally alter the leadership dynamics of the company. My father's expression tightened slightly. Not anger, concern, because Ethan wasn't entirely wrong. Major shareholders influence strategy. Strategy influences leadership, and leadership shapes the company's direction. Ethan continued. He said that for years he had worked inside the company under the assumption that one day he would lead it. That expectation wasn't just his personal ambition. It was something my father had openly prepared him for. My father didn't deny that. He simply watched quietly. Ethan's voice grew firmer. He said if a new investor entered the picture, especially one sitting across from him at the board table, it could change the entire succession plan. That meant the board wasn't just evaluating an investment. They were potentially choosing between two different futures. One where the company continued evolving under internal leadership, and another where outside capital began shaping its direction. Several relatives murmured softly. My Uncle Robert whispered something to my aunt. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck thoughtfully. My mother looked like she wanted the ground to swallow the entire conversation. But Ethan hadn't finished. He said something then that made the tension spike sharply. He said if the board believed I was simply another investor bringing capital into the company, then they were misunderstanding the situation. Because this wasn't just money entering the business, it was influence entering the family, and influence changes things. My father spoke carefully. He reminded Ethan that no decision had been made yet. The board still needed to review the financial structure, the equity distribution, and the long-term strategy. Ethan nodded. Exactly, which meant Monday's meeting would matter more than anyone realized. He looked at me again, and for the first time that night, there was no sarcasm in his voice. Just determination. He said if I truly believed this investment was the right move for the company, then I should be prepared to defend that belief in front of the entire board, not just the family. Because once the discussion moved into that room, it wouldn't be about childhood memories or Thanksgiving dinners. It would be about strategy, numbers, leadership, and the future of Harper Industrial Solutions. The backyard lights flickered slightly in the cold wind. Inside the tent, someone restarted the music, trying to pull the evening back toward celebration, but the mood outside had already changed. My father looked at both of us, then said something quietly. He said the board meeting on Monday had originally been scheduled to discuss financing options, but now it sounded like it might become something much larger, because the board wouldn't just be deciding whether the company needed new capital. They might also be deciding which vision for the company's future they trusted more. And as that realization settled over the backyard, it became clear that the real battle hadn't started yet. It was waiting for us in a conference room on Monday morning, part 27. Monday morning arrived faster than anyone in the backyard had expected. The Thanksgiving weekend passed in an uneasy blur. The family dinner eventually continued, but the laughter never quite returned to its earlier warmth. Conversations stayed lighter, safer. No one mentioned investments, equity, or board meetings again that night. But everyone had heard enough to understand that something serious was coming. By Monday, the tension had shifted from family curiosity to something far more structured. The boardroom at Harper Industrial Solutions looked exactly the way it always had. Large oak table, framed photographs of the company's early years along the walls, blueprints from the first factory expansion hanging behind my father's old chair at the head of the room. For decades, every major decision about the company had been made in this room. Today would be no different. But the stakes were different. When I walked in, several board members were already seated. Some of them had known me since I was a teenager. Others had only met me briefly over the past few months during preliminary investment conversations. Daniel sat near the far end of the table. He gave a small nod as I entered. Ethan was already there too. He stood near the windows with his arms folded, looking out over the factory yard where trucks were already loading the morning's shipments. My father sat at the head of the table. He looked older than he had a few days earlier. Not weak, just tired in the way people look when they know the next decision will shape the future of something they built with their own hands. One of the board members, Mr. Keller, cleared his throat as everyone settled into their seats. He said the purpose of the meeting was to review the capital proposal that had been circulating over the past few weeks. The company had reached a stage where expansion required a significant financial decision. There were 3 options on the table: large-scale debt financing, a strategic partnership with another manufacturing group, or outside equity investment. Each option carried advantages, each carried risk. Mr. Keller turned slightly toward me. He explained that one of the equity proposals came from an investment group that had been evaluating the company's growth potential for several months. That group had expressed interest in becoming the lead investor. Everyone in the room already knew what that meant. But hearing it stated formally changed the atmosphere. Ethan spoke before anyone else. He said that before the board discussed numbers, they should acknowledge something openly. This investment wasn't coming from a faceless institution. It was coming from someone with personal ties to the company, someone whose presence in the ownership structure would affect internal leadership dynamics. Several board members exchanged looks. My father didn't interrupt. Mr. Keller asked calmly whether Ethan believed that connection created a conflict of interest. Ethan answered carefully. He said it created complexity, because if the investment moved forward, the company wouldn't simply be accepting capital. It would be welcoming a new major voice into the room, one with both financial power and family history. Mr. Keller turned toward me. He asked if I wanted to respond. I did. But first, I placed a folder on the table. The documents inside outlined the proposal in full detail. Equity percentage, capital structure, board representation, strategic growth projections, the kind of documents that transform abstract discussions into real decisions. Several board members leaned forward to review the material. Mr. Keller studied the first few pages quietly. Then he said something that made Ethan glance sharply toward him. He said the board had already conducted a preliminary evaluation of the proposal. Financially, it was extremely competitive, more favorable than the debt options, more flexible than the strategic partnership offers. In simple terms, it gave the company the capital it needed without forcing it into long-term obligations that could restrict future growth. Ethan spoke again. He said numbers weren't the only factor the board needed to consider. Mr. Keller agreed, which was why they had asked one additional question during their internal discussions. The question now hung in the air. Mr. Keller looked directly at my father, then at Ethan, then at me, and he said the board needed to know whether the leadership of the company could remain unified if this investment moved forward. Because capital could strengthen a business, but leadership conflict could destroy one. The room fell silent. My father leaned back in his chair, slowly. 30 years of building the company had led to this moment. He looked first at Ethan, then at me, and said the next few minutes might determine the future of Harper Industrial Solutions. Not just financially, but personally. And as every board member in the room waited for our answers, the quiet rivalry that had begun in a backyard 3 nights earlier was about to decide the fate of the entire company. Part 28. The boardroom stayed quiet after my father finished speaking. No one shuffled papers. No one checked their phone. Even the faint hum of the factory outside the windows seemed distant, as if the room itself had sealed off the rest of the world. Mr. Keller's question still hung over the table. Could the leadership remain unified if this investment moved forward? It sounded like a corporate concern, but everyone in the room understood what it really meant. Could 2 brothers sit across from each other at the same table and still steer the same company in the same direction? My father looked first at Ethan. He had always believed Ethan would be the one sitting at the head of this room one day. For years, he had prepared him for that future. Factory walkthroughs, supplier negotiations, leadership meetings. Ethan had earned that position through work and proximity. Then my father looked at me, the son who had left, the one who chose a different industry, a different city, a different way of thinking about business. The son everyone assumed had stepped outside the family company's orbit. And yet somehow, here I was, sitting at the same table again, not as an employee, not as a guest, as the person holding the proposal that might fund the company's next decade of growth. Ethan finally spoke. His voice was calm, but the determination inside it was impossible to miss. He said the board deserved honesty. For years, he had believed his role in the company was clear. He worked toward leading it because that was the path everyone, including my father, had laid out. But leadership wasn't something you simply inherited. It was something you had to prove you could carry. He turned toward me, then toward the board, and said if the company truly needed outside capital to grow, he wouldn't stand in the way of that. The room shifted slightly. Not relief exactly, more like surprise. Ethan continued. He said the only thing he cared about was making sure the company remained strong enough to support the hundreds of people who depended on it. The workers in the factories, the suppliers, the families who had built their lives around the stability Harper Industrial Solutions provided. If accepting outside investment protected that future, then the board should consider it seriously. Mr. Keller watched him carefully, then asked the final piece of the question. Could he work with the investor sitting across from him? Ethan looked at me for a long moment. The tension from Thanksgiving night hadn't disappeared, but something had changed. Maybe it was the room. Maybe it was the realization that this wasn't about pride anymore. Finally, he nodded once. He said if the investment went forward, he would work with whoever helped the company succeed, even if that person happened to be his brother. A quiet exhale moved through the boardroom. Mr. Keller turned to me next. He asked whether I had anything to add before the board moved toward its decision. I did. I said the proposal in front of them wasn't about taking control of the company. It was about making sure the company had the resources to compete in an industry that was evolving faster every year. The factories, the workforce, the reputation my father had built over 3 decades. Those things were valuable. But value only survives if it adapts. I looked at Ethan, then at my father, then at the board. And I said the investment group believed Harper Industrial Solutions had the potential to become something much larger than a regional manufacturer. But reaching that future required 2 things: capital and leadership that understood both operations and strategy. That meant both of us. The room stayed quiet again. Mr. Keller closed the folder in front of him slowly. Then he said the board had enough information to proceed. They would review the proposal formally and vote on the investment structure later that afternoon. My father stood from his chair. For a moment, he simply looked around the room, the place where he had spent most of his adult life making decisions that shaped the company. Then he looked at his 2 sons. And for the first time, since the conversation began days earlier, there was something close to relief in his expression. Because the company he built wasn't just facing a financial decision, it was stepping into its next chapter. And whether anyone in the family had expected it or not, both of his sons were now part of that future.